Good evening, everyone. I think I'm live. All right. Everything is now being recorded. So that means if I say anything wrong, you can go back and say, here's the moment when you did that. So if I act any more nervous than usual, that's part of the reason why, and you're part of the reason for that too. But hey, I appreciate you all letting me be back here tonight. I hope that last night went well for you. I was encouraged and edified by your presence, and I certainly hope that tonight we can keep the ball rolling and I can do my very best to return the favor to you. I also wanted to say thanks for that prayer. There was a Brother Luke in the audience. There's one more. And I liked what you said about us being able to meet with other Christians here. At the very least, if you don't like what I have to say or it just really hurts your eyes to look at me, you're going to get to meet some other brothers and sisters here tonight. Some who have traveled quite a ways, some that I certainly know well, and some I don't know as well, but hope to. And so again, I do appreciate it. I certainly hope to encourage you to the very best of my ability as we are here this evening. Just a little bit of a recap from where we've been and where we're going. Last night we kind of set the stage for what my goal is over these next couple of days. And really I say next couple of days, tonight and tomorrow. But I entitled it, Where Are You Going and Where Have You Been? And some of you might recall that came from the book of Judges 19, where an old farmer asked a Levite on his travels where it was he was going and where it was he had been. And how in that story that just unfolded into a terrible tragedy, but it gave me this idea because of another story to think about where we as God's people have been and where it is we're going. And so we started in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And if you want to turn over there with me just real quick, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we'll brush up a little bit on our history from just the past couple of days just to get us a good idea of where we've been to establish the stage for tonight. But over 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when Paul was writing this letter, the first letter we know of, to the Christians in the city of Corinth, he wanted them to understand and to remember the importance of these Old Testament scriptures. And we'll just read a few of those verses. We won't read all of them that we read last night. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, down in verse 1, all the way down in verse 1, this is what Paul wrote. He said, Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things, he says in verse 6, now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, as some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. And so that was just a snippet of some of the verses we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 last night. But there were two verses we looked at in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 a little bit closer than the rest of them. And the first one was over in verse 6. And in verse 6, Paul gave us a glimpse as to one of the reasons why we have these Old Testament scriptures. There's nothing wrong with the New Testament. New Testament is a great, great part of the Bible. But maybe all too often as Christians we forget that the vast majority of the Bible that we have is Old Testament scriptures. And Paul in verse 6 reminded these Christians in Corinth, and he reminds us today, that these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And then in verse 11 he reminded them that these things happened as examples so that ultimately we can learn from their mistakes. They were written for our admonition. They were written for our instruction. And we kind of echoed those ideas that are probably familiar to most of us, those ideas that those who don't learn from their past are going to be doomed to repeat it. And history is a very important thing, an important topic, especially in terms of the history of God's people. And so last night, that was kind of the gist of what we talked about, how these Old Testament stories are meant to give us instruction. And then we skipped over to Romans 15, where Paul said these things were also written so that we might have hope. These stories aren't just, full of people's mistakes so we can look back and think, boy, how dumb were they? Let's learn from that. But they were also written so that we can have hope. And so I said also in the title of this series that these were going to be stories of instruction and hope. And so tonight, we can finally get to one of those stories. And whenever I tell a story, I'll just tell you, I love a good story. And I like telling a good story. And when I'm not working at the water company and I'm not preaching, every blue moon I might get to go to Mammoth Cave. I used to give cave tours, and I loved it because you could tell people all these stories. And I'll never forget what somebody once told me, because since we're being recorded, I don't want to incriminate anybody, even though it was years ago. Somebody once told me, they said, Luke, when it comes to a good story, you can't let facts get in the way. You can't let facts get in the way of a good story. And so we'd always say, well, okay, so you got to be careful with any story. But the beauty of this story tonight is it's a true story. And it's one of the stories that Paul references in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And in that chapter, from verse 6 down to verse 11, Paul makes about 3 or 4 references to some of these Old Testament stories. And it's not the only letter where he does that. All throughout the New Testament, there are references that Jesus makes to the Old Testament. There's references Paul makes. We read a little bit in 1 Peter last night. Peter talks about some of the prophecies made in the Old Testament. And if you take the time to read through some of these stories, some of you might have picked up on some of these more familiar stories. It's kind of like a movie reference. Me and my siblings, whenever we'd go on big trips, we used to have a DVD player in one of our Suburbans. Now, years ago, we had a Suburban that had this really cool box that had a VHS player built into it. And it was duct taped into the dash. And, we really felt like hot stuff because, we could watch TV on a VHS on the road, and it was pretty cool. And we watch all kinds of great movies. And it never failed my siblings. We try to reference these movies in our quotes and on our little side sayings. And, if you could pick up on the reference, it all depended on how well you knew the story. Well, here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul makes some of those references. And did you pick up on any of them last night? I bet some of you did. Some of you might have thought, hey, I remember that story. Well, this story tonight is one I bet you'll remember. I can remember in Sunday school it was a story that was scary, it was cool, and believe it or not, it's not very long, but I'm going to drag it out longer than it probably needs to be. But it's a good story. And it comes from the book of Numbers. And as you turn over to the book of Numbers, you might have caught down in verse 9, where Paul referenced a story about serpents. Now, if you don't like snakes tonight, don't worry. I didn't bring any. It's not that kind of service. Not tonight, anyway. But over in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, is a story about some snakes. But before we can jump into that story, the setting is always important. We got to set the stage. So what in the world is going on in the book of Numbers? Well, in the book of Numbers, this takes place in the days of Israelites' wanderings through the wilderness. And it was a rough time to be an Israelite. There's a lot of cool times in history where I think I would really like to go back and watch these events unfold. And there's some events I would have loved to have been present at. Numbers is not one of them. This is not one of those stories I wish I could have relived. A lot of times we look back in history and we think, boy, what a time to be alive. And when you read Numbers 21, you might say the same thing, but not in a good way. What a time to be alive. Back in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul talked about how God was very disappointed with the Israelites. And all throughout the books of Exodus and Numbers, it was almost like one argument after another between God and his people. And you might sometimes scratch your head and wonder, well, how in the world did the Israelites ever get to this point? Well, the long and short of it is, Israel was living in captivity in Egypt. And by the beginning of the book of Exodus, Joseph was long dead. And the people and leaders of Egypt had forgot about Joseph. They forgot about his God, if they knew anything about him at all. And now all that Egypt had was all of these Israelite slaves that were getting way too plentiful, and they didn't like it. So the beginning of Exodus, we get the story of the 10 plagues. And ultimately what happens, God delivers his people from the Egyptians, but despite being delivered, was Israel very grateful for what God did? Well, there were times they were grateful. There were times where they were really glad when they got to the other side of the Red Sea or when God would grant them victory, but it never failed. They would always grow upset. So it was just this big roller coaster of emotions. And God told them that He had a homeland for them, a promised land, if you will, that He promised, going all the way back to Abraham, that would be theirs. But unfortunately, they wanted to take the detour. They didn't want to put their faith and trust in God, and so they disobeyed Him constantly. And so by the book of Numbers, chapter 21, it's just one issue after another. But by this point in the story of Numbers chapter 21, something else that's happened that's really big is Moses is getting old. And shortly before this, perhaps his closest confidant, Aaron, the high priest of his day, has passed away. And so Moses has been given this task to lead the people of Israel. And even though in one sense it's very simple and straightforward, trust in God and do what He says, even Moses himself struggled with it. Before Aaron passed away, not too long before Numbers chapter 21, was the story where Moses struck a rock. If you remember that story, God told Moses, go speak to that rock and water will come forth. And Moses, maybe he was aggravated. Maybe he was tired of traveling on the road with hundreds of thousands of people, asking for directions, complaining one thing after another. And so he struck that rock, and God said, Moses, you don't get to go into the promised land now. And so now Moses' dreams and hopes have been crushed. His friend Aaron is dead. And life for Moses and so many of the Israelites, I have no doubt, was very, very stressful. Sometimes when we look back on the past, it's easy to think, boy, if only they would have done this. But in the moment, things aren't always clear, are they? I mean, looking back, things might be a little bit more clear. I mean, the old saying, hindsight is what? It's 20/20. And you can look back and think, boy, I wish I would have done this. Why didn't I do that? But in the moment, it's hard. It's difficult. You don't always think about the long-term consequences. Sometimes you don't have time to, but that's where the Israelites are. So what happens in Numbers chapter 21? Well, in Numbers chapter 21, starting in verse 1, this is what we read. So chapter 21 of the book of Numbers, starting in verse 1, this is what we read. The king of Arad, the Canaanite who dwelt in the south, heard that Israel was coming on the road to Erethaim. And then he fought against Israel and took some of them prisoners. And so Israel made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities. And the Lord listened to the voice of Israel and delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their cities. And so the name of the place was called Hormah. And then in verse 4, we read, then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. And therefore the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that He take away the serpents from us. And so Moses prayed for the people. And then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. And it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. And so Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. And so it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. And so, there's our story for the night. There's our story. So the first 3 verses, what's going on now? Well, Israel is still wandering. And as they wander through this wilderness out of Egypt, they're wandering as this big tribe of people. The only way you could think about it in terms of our own history today would be like the Indians in the plains. They were a nomadic people. In the mid 1800s, you think about the Indians hunting for the buffalo in the 1700s. Well, here in Numbers chapter 21, the Israelites, they're this nomadic people. They're traveling from spot to spot to spot. And as they do, they're just bumping into problems all along the way. But for whatever reason, in these first 3 verses, they have a moment of clarity, don't they? They bump into this king of Arad, this Canaanite, who finds out that Israel's approaching. And when he finds out all these random people are approaching his country, he doesn't like the sound of it. Hundreds of thousands of people that Egypt had evicted are now approaching his home. And so he gathers up his armies, gathers up his troops, and he fights against these foreigners. And some of them he even takes prisoner. Now at this stage you might think this is the end of Israel. Even though it's just a couple of sentences, here you have this huge number of people who are being pushed around by nation after nation. And now it might look as if Israel is done. Aaron is dead. Moses no longer is going to be able to go into the promised land, and life as they know it is about to be doomed. But there's this amazing moment of clarity. Despite their defeats, despite the discouragement, we read in verse 2 that Israel made a vow to the Lord. Now, who made this vow to the Lord? Well, it says Israel did. The whole country. All of these people seemed to be united enough in this common effort that they were in. They realized we need to do something different. We need to put our trust in God. We need to give our problems up to Him. And so they make a promise. Now, have you ever made a promise before in a desperate situation? You realize you're in a real tight spot and there's no other way out, and you've got to do something. So maybe you throw up a prayer and you say, Lord, if only you'll do this, we'll be good. I can remember in school there was a professor who used to joke. He always saw people pray more before an exam, people he didn't even know believed in the power of prayer. He said, you give people a pop quiz, and they'll be religious real fast. And so maybe you've been in that situation before. Well, Israel was in that spot. And they take this prayer up to the Lord, and they say to the Lord, if you will indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities. And so they're making this deal with God. If you could just deliver them over to us, if we put our faith and trust in you, help us destroy them. And so in verse 3, we read the Lord listened. He listened to the voice of His people. Maybe one good lesson we can remember out of this, if nothing else, God listens to His people. You may pray to God and you might think He's not listening because I can't hear Him. Well, He can hear you. He listens. And so He listens to His people. And we read that He delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their cities. So the name of the place was called Hormah. And even though we just read about that in one verse, essentially what happens is a big battle, maybe a series of battles. A campaign unfolds, and Israel wins. Now, I've never been in any situation like that, but that's a lot of stuff going on, isn't there? And it's all just summed up in one verse. And so they went to battle, and they won. That's a great part of the story. And if only the story would have just ended there, and Israel lived happily ever after because they trusted in God and everything went smooth. But that's not what happened at all. And it's not only is that not the only reason that it happened, but by verse 4, what starts to unfold, even though it's not good, is a pretty good story. Because in verse 4, as they are on their journey, they're still traveling around this place known as the land of Edom. Now, we won't go back to it, but if you look in chapter 20, this land of Edom was owned by another kingdom, and the Israelites, for whatever reason, didn't choose to put their faith and trust in God and fight against these people. They went around them. And so here they're still making their way around through this detour. And as they do, what naturally do you think starts to happen? Well, the same thing that happens on any road trip you've ever taken. People get tired. People get aggravated. The air conditioning goes out. The gas tank runs low. Tire starts to leak a little air. The TV don't work in the car. We've got problems. Well, the Israelites had problems. Their sandals are wearing at their feet. It's probably pretty hot in the Middle East, about year-round in the part of the world that they're in. Not only are they getting aggravated, they realize that while they're here, they seem to be isolated and all alone. Verse 4 says they grew very discouraged, and they get so aggravated and so mad, their mental complaints become verbal ones. Now, we've all been there. You ever been so aggravated you start to vent? Sometimes venting's okay when it's done properly. But what do the Israelites do? Well, they start to vent to God and to Moses. But they're not taking their problems up to God in a very righteous way. The way the New King James words it is that they spoke against God and against Moses. And it implies that their complaints aren't just generic, hey, Lord, we're having a hard time, can you help us out? But it's complaints as if they're blaming God and Moses for their circumstances that they're in. Verse 5, we read what the people said. They cried out, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Now just think about that first question for a moment. How did they end up there anyway? Well, God's the one who got us out. Moses parted the sea and led us across. Lord, it's your fault we're here. We didn't want to be here. We'd rather be in Egypt. We'd rather go there. You just brought us out here to die. Imagine if that was a complaint you made to somebody. Maybe you've been in a tight spot before and somebody got you out of it. Maybe a mom or a dad or a grandparent. And maybe you did something really dumb and they said, you know what, I'm going to get you out of this, but you're not going to like the solution. Maybe you got aggravated, but in the long haul, they really saved your tail. Well, that's what was happening here, but they didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. They weren't remembering where they had been. They had forgotten what God had done. Just a few moments before when they defeated this Canaanite leader, they had forgotten all about it. They forgot their past. And they went on to even complain in the latter part of verse 5. They said, there's no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. I feel like this was the straw that broke the camel's back. They said, not only are we out here just to die, but we've got nothing good to eat in this house. There's nothing to eat except for this worthless bread. Now, what's that worthless bread they're talking about? Well, it's manna. And this manna came from who? Well, it came from God. Now, we don't exactly know what manna was, but it's described as bread. And if you go back to chapter 11 of the book of Numbers, they describe it in a little bit of detail, the writer of Numbers does, because guess what the Israelites did in Numbers chapter 11? They complained about the manna again. But yet God saw fit that this was the food that would give them the nourishment they needed on their journey. They were just to pick it up day by day as it fell, not to get too much and certainly not to get too little. And yet here they have the audacity to say, we've got nothing to eat except for this worthless bread you gave us. Did Israel help, by the way, cooking any of that bread? Did they have anything to do with the making of that bread? No, that was all God. And I'm no expert in the field of compliments and insults, but if somebody makes you a meal, do you think that's the best response to have? Well, all I've got is this worthless chocolate pie. It's not as good as last week's. These leftovers, ugh. We ain't got nothing to eat in this house. If you don't believe me, try it. Be my guest. Maybe you'll come in with a black eye or two tomorrow. Well, here they did that to who? Well, they didn't do it to an angry wife. They didn't do it to an angry mom or dad. They complained to the creator of the universe. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, isn't it? And Israel's about to find out again. That's what's even crazier about this. This isn't the first time they've had this argument. And it's kind of funny, too, because it's easy to look back and think, I would never have a silly argument with the same person over and over. I look in the mirror and I see a guy who's done it tons of times. I don't know why, but when you become a teenager, that seems to be the prime time to do it. You ever have arguments like that, just silly conversations, and you look back like, boy, I was dumb. And then you're like, I'm still not too bright now. It's tough. Well, Israel struggled with that. So maybe that's another lesson tucked away here. But they take their complaints against God and against Moses. And so in verse 6, God responds. Now, some people look at stories like this and they say, boy, God is mean. And what does God do here? Well, in verse 6, we read, the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. So does God like it when we blame things on Him? He doesn't like it. Now, you might say, well, Luke, I don't know, maybe there's a case to be made here. I mean, God got them out of Egypt. He put this in this situation. Maybe it is kind of God's fault. But if you look in the stories of the Old Testament, what you'll find to be true is that people tend to reap what they sow. In Galatians chapter 6, Paul reminded the Christians of Galatia that. And now Israel is unfortunately reaping what they sow. And I would be willing to argue that the only times you see people not reaping what they sow, it's because God's showing them mercy. Because could God have done far worse far sooner? Oh, you betcha. He could have been far harsher. But if you think back into the book of Hebrews, when God punishes His people, He doesn't punish people He hates, does He? He doesn't chastise people He doesn't care about. In Hebrews chapter 12, the writer there reminded us that God chastens those He loves. He cared enough about His people that He wanted them to learn and listen and know that He's real. He's not to be mocked. He's not to be disrespected. And certainly He's not to be complained against in this way. Because He's God. He's worthy to be praised. He's worthy to be worshiped. And so the people of Israel were dealing with their punishment. Now, nobody in a moment of punishment looks at that and thinks, boy, thanks God for this. I really appreciate it. If you read Hebrews chapter 12, the writer talks about that. And even in my own life, when I think about all the punishments I got, my siblings would probably say I didn't get enough. I felt like I got more than my fair share. But hey, so here we are. We made it. We're here now. And I can tell you all the times I got punishments, I never looked at mom or dad and said, hey, thanks for that whipping. I really deserve that. I appreciated it. We never feel that way in the moment. Never feel that way. And believe it or not, Israel didn't feel that way either. They were upset. They were angry. They were disgruntled. But in verse 7, guess what the people finally did? Well, they came to their senses. And they said, we got to fix this. We're in trouble. We've messed up. And we need the problem resolved. And unlike in the beginning of chapter 21, who do they go to with this problem? They don't immediately go to God, do they? They don't take their prayer up to God as a unified people. Instead, they go to Moses. And they say, Moses, we've sinned. They say, we have sinned, for we've spoken against the Lord and against you. Therefore, they say, pray to the Lord that He take away the serpents from us. And so Moses prayed for the people. And I think this is kind of a funny part of the story. What happens, imagine if you will, the last time you did something really bad and you knew your parents were going to be in trouble. Would you typically go to the ones you were in trouble with? More often than not, you wouldn't. You'd go to a sibling, or if you were like me, you'd go to the grandparents because you would think, well, they're the parents' parents. If I can get good with them, I'm in the clear. And so you would go to somebody and say, hey, Mom and Dad are really mad. Can you go talk to them for me? That's what the Israelites do. They say, we don't want to talk to God. We know we've messed up. We realize our sin. We recognize our mistake. And we need a mediator. Oh, I've read that word somewhere. We need a mediator between us and God. Will you go do it? And so Moses, despite losing Aaron, despite not getting the promise to go into the promised land anymore, does it. He prays for the people who complained against him. I mean, think about that for a moment. They blamed Moses for their situation. And yet Moses has enough mercy and patience and kindness to say, you know what, I'll do that. I'll pray to God on your behalf. I'll talk to Him. We'll see what happens. So Moses prays to the Lord, and in verse 8, how does that conversation go? Goes a lot better than expected, doesn't it? Verse 8 we read, that the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent, set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten when he looks on it shall live. You know what God does? He makes a way of escape. He provides a way for His people to be saved. He provides a way for them to avoid the punishment they so desperately deserved. Boy, does that sound like something from the New Testament. It's almost like this story isn't just meant to instruct us, but give us hope about something or someone to come. So this fiery serpent is put onto a pole. And we read in verse 9 that Moses made this bronze serpent. He put it on a pole. And so it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. And that's the story. I remember in college, me and my buddies were talking about all these Old Testament stories, and somebody brought this story up one time. And I said, yeah, where is that story? That was a good story. We heard that a lot as a kid. And I remember when we finally looked it up, I thought, well, that's not a big story at all. That's only 5 or 6 sentences, and we would talk about that for a few weeks. It's like, that's not that big of a story, but a lot goes on in that story. And that was it. God provides a way for His people to be rescued. So we've already, cherry-picked through here a lot of lessons we can learn from this story. Don't disrespect God. Recognize that God's in charge. Put your faith and trust in God. Along those same lines, we learn that God is in fact merciful, but God is also just. We see both sides of that concerning God. And there's countless other lessons I think we can learn from this particular story. But here in a minute, we're going to jump to John chapter 3 where we see where this story gives us hope. But just something for your own reading later tonight. I encourage you to look up whatever happened to this serpent. Because this is not the last time in the Old Testament we read about this fiery serpent on a pole. If you get a chance to read about a guy in 2 Kings named Hezekiah, we read about this serpent on a pole one more time. But that's another story for another day. But when you think about this story, how can this story give us hope? Well, in one sense, it does show us of the mercy of God. It shows us of the grace of God and His lovingness and caringness for His people. But if you skip with me all the way to the book of John, one more passage we'll look at tonight, in the book of John. And in the 3rd chapter, Jesus Himself has a very interesting conversation with somebody where this snake on a pole comes into the conversation. And in John chapter 3, this is a passage I bet most of you, if you're a Christian in this room, have read before. And in John chapter 3, Jesus is about to have a conversation with a man named, you remember? Nicodemus. And we're going to look in this chapter. We're going to read more than what we're going to talk about, but we're going to read it just so you get a good grasp of what it is we're looking at. But in John chapter 3, starting in verse 1, and this is where the hope part of the story really comes to play, I think. But in John chapter 3 and in verse 1, John writes that there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to Him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these things that you do unless God is with him. And Jesus answered and said to him, Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he's old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? And Jesus answered, Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I said to you, You must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. And in verse 9, Nicodemus answered and said to him, How can these things be? So just quick pause here. Nicodemus was one of those Pharisee leaders. But unlike a lot of the other Pharisees, he really listened to what Jesus had to say. And he was seemingly convinced that Jesus was and is somebody of great prominence. But he was worried about what his colleagues would think about him. Maybe you felt that way before. You don't want other people to know what you think about Jesus. You know, if you tell people you believe Jesus is the Son of God, they might look at you funny. If you tell people that I think Jesus really did rise from the grave, they might look at you and think, hey, that's not possible. Well, Nicodemus was worried what his colleagues would think about him if they knew what he thought about Jesus. So he snuck off to Jesus in the night. And he had this conversation with Jesus, and he said, look, a lot of us realize, at least I do, that these things you're doing aren't just, magic tricks. You're somebody of great importance. You're a big deal. And he has this conversation with Jesus about being born again. And Jesus tells Nicodemus, you must be born again. That's what needs to happen, Nicodemus. And so by verse 10, Jesus unveils this much deeper conversation. And in verse 10 we read, Jesus answered and said to him, Are you the teacher of Israel, and do not know these things? Most assuredly I say to you, we speak what we know, and testify what we have seen, and you do not receive our witness. If I have told you earthly things, and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended to heaven, but he who came down from heaven. and that is the Son of Man who is in heaven. And note verse 14. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn it, but that the world through him might be saved. There's a lot we could unpack tonight, and we won't for the sake of time. But do you see a connection between Numbers chapter 21 and why a story like that could give us hope? Well, Jesus says here in John chapter 3, as he's having this conversation with Nicodemus about being born again, he asks him a question. Verse 10, he says, "Are you the teacher of Israel and do not know these things?" He says, "These things I'm talking about, you call yourself a teacher, but you really don't understand." He said, "Let me tell you what this is all about." And he references an Old Testament story and says, Nicodemus, just like Moses lifted up a serpent onto a pole, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. What was Jesus talking about? He's talking about his own crucifixion. He was alluding to the idea that this story about a serpent being put up on a pole was foreshadowing him. And even though the Israelites in Numbers chapter 21 wouldn't have known that, I'm sure they would have had no idea about that. For us as Christians, when we look back on that story, if Nicodemus was expected to understand it, don't you think we probably are too? And think about the resources we have at our disposal that Nicodemus didn't have. He didn't have the full book of John. Now, granted, he got to have a conversation with Jesus, and that's pretty cool. But we've got it all right here in multiple versions. We've got the letters of Paul, the letters of Peter, James, and John, so many people. And if he was expected to understand that, I'm sure we are too. And he goes on to say that this wasn't just a foreshadowing of Jesus, but of everything he was going to do. Verse 15, he said that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. And then in verse 16, this is a Bible verse. It's written everywhere. It's everywhere, isn't it? It's on Bible covers. It's on phone screen backgrounds. If you go into any public restroom, you'll see this verse written on the wall. It's everywhere. And this is the context of this verse. He's talking about a reference of the book of Numbers, chapter 21, and how God provided a way for his people to be rescued, for his people to be saved. And in verse 16, he said that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. The plan all along is for God to rescue his people. And so in the Old Testament, even though it looks like this peculiar game of cat and mouse where God likes his people one day and doesn't like his people another, that's not at all what the Old Testament is. But it's a story of God trying to rescue his people, leading up to Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life to be saved. And that's something we can all enjoy as Christians, right? That's great news. And if you're a Christian in this room, even though you may have not have heard this story in quite that way before, I bet that's probably information you already knew, isn't it? Because if you're a Christian, you've been rescued. You've been saved. And was that something you did all on your own? Well, if we could save ourselves, we wouldn't need Jesus. But we needed Jesus for that. And John talks about the importance of our belief. And in the book of Ephesians, chapters 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, Paul talks all about this gospel. And in the beginning of that letter, he talks about how it's because of God's grace through our faith that we can be rescued. But this is all possible because of God, because of his Son. And if it weren't for him, we'd be doomed. And when you read these stories in the Old Testament and you look at John chapter 3, Jesus reminds us that God's goal isn't just to punish everybody because that's what he wants to do. He wants to save everybody. But here's the thing. Us being saved puts some responsibility on our shoulders, doesn't it? When you think back to the book of Numbers chapter 21, was everyone who was bitten by a snake rescued? No, because some of them died. It wasn't until they did what? Until they believed in what God was capable of doing and looked at that serpent on a pole. Well, what's the equivalent for us today? Well, at the end of the book of Mark, when Jesus was about to ascend into heaven, he said, look, folks, as you go out and preach the gospel to all these people, let them know that everyone who believes and is baptized will be saved. And all throughout the letters Paul writes, he reminds Christians of that, doesn't he? We've got to have a genuine belief in Christ. If you don't believe in the power of God, then don't bother being dipped. You're just going to be wet. But if you do believe in the genuine power of Jesus Christ, why sit back and do nothing? I mean, the Israelites could have said in the book of Numbers, yeah, I bet God probably could save us. And then went home. That would have been crazy, wouldn't it? And yet how many people do you know would say, hey, I do believe that God's real. Yeah, I think he probably is the Son of God, and then just don't do anything about it. Well, that's not faith. That's not a real belief. I mean, even the demons believe and tremble, right? And so just like how they had to look upon that pole, well, in the New Testament, Paul reminds these Christians, hey, you were baptized into Christ to be born again. And it all goes hand in hand. It all goes together. It's all equally important. And for us as Christians, hopefully that's not news we don't know. That's news we already know. It's not new news. But if you're here tonight and you are a Christian, I bet you know somebody that doesn't know that, right? Maybe you know somebody who has no understanding of the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I hope that at least another good thing you can get out of this lesson is use that information and share it with others so that they can know. But when it's all said and done as Christians, again, when you think about these Old Testament stories like Numbers chapter 21, yes, they're full of instruction, but boy, what a neat connection. That's neat, isn't it? How that was a reference back to Jesus, all the way to the book of Numbers chapter 21. And just as a random side note, if you get a chance to look in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 again, do you remember who Paul said they tempted in that moment? Go back and read it. I referenced it last night. See who the Israelites tempted in the book of Numbers chapter 21. And it'll give you another unique perspective on Christ maybe. But that all being said again here tonight, if you're here though and you're not a Christian, and maybe you've been doing some studying about the gospel and you know what you need to do, I'd encourage you to use our time together wisely tonight. Maybe you're ready to make that confession that Jesus is the Son of God. Maybe you're ready to be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins, to be born again. I'd encourage you to use our time together tonight wisely. But if you're here tonight and, hey, you don't know any of that, we'll talk to you about it. Don't treat salvation like a glorified insurance policy, right? Sometimes we just want to get people in and out. We'll say, hey, let's get them out of hell. We'll get them into heaven and be on their way. But it's a lifestyle change. And all throughout Paul's letters, he tells us about that. So if that's a conversation you need to have, let's have that conversation. But that all being said tonight, our song of invitation is number 184, right? Number 184. And if there's anything we can help you with, I'd encourage you to use our time together wisely, perhaps while we stand and while we sing the song of invitation.